Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Banks, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 16th Annual St. Cuthbert Society Fellows Lecture. And it's the first one to be given in this online forum. The lecture series was initiated by the late Professor Roy Boyne when he was principal of the Society. As this is a public lecture, some of you may not know that St. Cuthbert Society is one of the oldest student communities of Durham University, originally having been founded in the 19th century by undergraduates themselves, and it is now one of the constituent colleges of the university. The Fellows of St. Cuthbert Society are a group of senior Common Room members recognised by the college in contributing substantially to its life in some way. And I have the particular honour of chairing the Fellows and of introducing this evening's lecture. It's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dame Julia Cleverdon, DCVO and CBE. We only wish that she could be with us in Durham, and that we could reward her with Cuth's famous hospitality. But that must wait for another day. The present cloud silver lining, however, is that we can also welcome you, our audience, from many parts of Britain and indeed from the world. At this point, I would normally give a potted curriculum vitae of our speaker. But as Dame Julia's remarkable career is the subject is itself the subject of the lecture this evening, I'll be particularly brief. As Julia Cleverdon, she graduated from Newnham College, Cambridge, with a degree in history, and she holds honorary degrees from Warwick University and from Harper Adams University. Her background is in industrial relations, but her move to the Industrial Society marked the beginning of her career campaigning for social justice. You will soon hear much more of that. For the moment, I will mention in particular Teach First, which she chaired, since Durham University has strong links with that organisation. There are many others, as you will hear. Indeed, if you were to draw a spider diagram of some of the most important and influential national and international charities, Julia Cleverdon's name would be in the centre. In recognition of her work, she was made first a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1996, then in the 2002 New Year's Honours, Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, becoming Dame Commander in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2008. But perhaps her most important accolade is that in 2015, she was Kirsty Young's guest on Desert Island Discs. It seemed to me that the eclectic choice of records from Richard Burton reading Under Milkwood through Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive to a Beethoven bagatelle is a true reflection of the wide range of her interests and activities. I was struck by the modesty of her luxury item, a 2,000-piece jigsaw of Venice. Many of the fellows here this evening will know of my own great love of anything Venetian, so my only surprise was that it wasn't a 5,000-piece jigsaw. I think we're in for a rare treat, and so I will now ask Dame Julia to give us her reflections on a career campaigning for social justice and how young people can make a difference.
Well,
over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob. What a lovely and blush-making introduction. I couldn't be more grateful and more honoured to be invited to do this particular lecture. It seemed to me that for me and Professor Liz Archibald, as I know her, our lives have been intertwined since our late teens, as we arrived, as you say, at Newnham College, Cambridge, 50 years ago. Her career turns a page this summer as she stands down from her leadership of St. Cuthbert's. And nothing could give me greater pleasure than to use this as an opportunity to thank her for what she has done for 9 cohorts of students in that vital educational purpose of preparing young people to give more and get more from their lives. So one of her great abilities, apart as far as I can see, from persuading the whole college to dine in the dark on a regular basis, is to invite a range of those from the academic and the working world to come and discuss and debate with the college and the wider community a whole range of issues. I came to the equivalent gathering with another great friend, Lord Faulkner, Tony Blair's Lord Chancellor, a year or so back. He was also at Cambridge with me and Philippa Fawcett, who I see on the postage stamps here, in, I think, 2018-19. It was a fascinating occasion, not least to see Charlie write a very erudite legal lecture, as far as I could see, on the back of an envelope, and then deliver it with incredible elan. I'm not anything like as clever as Charlie is on the ability to actually speak away. Then we had a delicious dinner at the college, and then we went to the pub with Mike Barton and his lovely wife, your famous chief constable, and it was the most magical evening. So alas, the global pandemic has prevented the train, the lovely dinner, the chance to meet and debate in person, and instead to Zoom away in our front rooms. But I hope that it whiles away another hour before lockdown lifts. But I do hope to come and see Liz in Durham before she leaves. It's a great topic for me, partly because, as my best friends have always told me, I am the least reflective person they have ever met. So forcing me to reflect on what I've learned from a career of 50 years as a campaigner for social justice has been very great therapy for me. I don't know if it's interesting for you, but it's been fascinating. And it is worth for any members of the student population who are on this Zoom, just endorsing the value of student politics and college life on preparing the skills that you need for the long distance campaign run. I was the president of the Junior Common Room at Newnham with my old friend, Julia Neuberger, and we stood on a joint ticket with a manifesto of a launderette for student use and compulsory bicycle classes for freshers. And as most of our competitors at that time for the JCR presidency were marching for freedom and burning down the Garden House Hotel, they seemed in a way rather tame demands. But I probably always tended to evolution rather than revolution. And it is always simpler to get an actionable first step. And that is my first reflection on campaigning for change. What precisely do you actually want people to do differently? And can you explain that in a lift with an important person who you want to engage in your cause? Compulsory bicycle classes for freshers was a demand from having watched in my first term on a roundabout a geography fresher born in a small village in Hull wobble on her new bicycle into the path of a lorry and be killed. That is the first time I remember thinking how appalling this tragedy was. What could we have done differently? And how could I have helped affect that change? Hence compulsory bicycle classes for all freshers. Leaving Cambridge, I thought I should go into large-scale social justice. So I applied, age 21, to be an assistant prison governor, an assistant hospital secretary, and something very secret in the Secret Service, which I never understood and don't think I got the job. But I did get the other jobs in those rather halcyon days, but surprisingly decided to take none of them and to go, luckily, instead, into British Leyland to the Swindon Body and Assembly Plant, with 33,000 men on one site, a rework line, because we were very bad at making cars, going 3 times around Swindon, and me as a junior graduate trainee in the Industrial Relations Department. Those first 2 years of my life, for all of us, think back to your first 2 years of working life, was an absolute wake-up call. I learned so much in the first 2 years on that front line, negotiating, communicating, marveling at the inability of leaders to consult before they decided, or to explain why decisions had been taken, carrying the notebooks in and out of the industrial relations negotiations, 48 separate trade unions on that site. As I say, 33,000 people. And it was the best possible training for social justice campaigning. I know now that none of the toughest social justice issues in Britain will be solved by one sector alone. So going into the corporate sector early on, starting at British Leyland, going on to Anglo-American in South Africa, moving to the Industrial Society for 15 years, then being the chief exec of business of the community for another 15 years, gave me a real grounding in the corporate sector, helped me to have a sense of the role, the value, and the values of the better businesses that could help to make the difference. Enough of me, that's the sort of thumbnail. Have I learned anything of value for anyone else? Let me take 5 campaigning results over 50 years, either involving young people or impacting on young people, and seeing what lessons I can draw out. And I've tried to pull most of my examples from out of the Northeast in solidarity with Durham. They're not all, but I think 3 of them are. As the new chief executive of Business in the Community in the 90s, we had 850 companies in membership by the time we'd finished this particular program. And the particular program which I learned most from was something called the Seeing is Believing program, aiming at chief executives of major businesses to come and spend some time, a day or so, with community entrepreneurs or head teachers in tough places, on housing estates, with drug dealers, in prisons, in places that by and large, senior leaders in the business world, they may have come from those places, but they certainly weren't in them now. And I suppose those places, by this government's narrative, would now be called left behind places. Prince of Wales was the president of Business in the Community, and over 15 years, he invited some 9,000 leaders to come on a visit, write a report back to him on what they'd seen and what they were going to do differently. And the organization of all of that fell to me. I went on nearly every visit. So spent 15 years having the incredible opportunity of watching leaders as they went to those places, hearing the conversations and being inspired by the community entrepreneurs or the head teachers all over the country in the toughest places. This is not to be studied, in my experience, as a think tank, as a desk exercise. Social justice campaigning requires deep immersion with those who understand the issue, what I think would now be called lived experience. The best experts have dirty shoes and are in the places walking alongside. So in 1999, I remember it now, I was with Mike Darrington, who ran Greg's the Bakers. And we were in West Walker Primary School in the East End of Newcastle with a harassed head teacher at the start of his day. He was trying to talk to chief executives, 10 of them that we brought, and run a breakfast for his school children, slopping about with the Weetabix and trying to find the spoons. We spent an inspiring morning in his school. And at the end, Mike said to him, "You're a fantastic head teacher, and you must concentrate on what you do best, which is teaching. We at Greggs are pretty good at serving breakfast, and we're getting better. And we will take that on with the volunteers and the partnerships that we'll help to develop with you. And try to tackle the social issue, which is that kids who haven't had breakfast can't concentrate for the morning." Surely someone said he fed them before he taught them. And the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring at Durham University did the original research 2 years later to validate the results with Greggs. And now, more than 20 years later, Greggs with partners support more than 600 clubs in the poorest places, serving 31,000 primary school children every morning. So rewind for those who mind about social justice and campaigning. What you do, you've got to develop a simple answer at the front line, which can be scaled. You've got to have a compelling evidence, preferably by a high quality university, that it makes a difference to the social issue. Hungry children can't learn. You've got to get sectors to do what they do best and not muck about getting the corporate sector to teach when they can't teach, or the education sector to serve breakfast when it's not their best skill. The answers are not all about money. Partnerships to spread the load are the only way of finding the resource. Courageous leaders with influence are the key people to cultivate. Connecting the unconnected is not a duty, is not an option, it's a duty. So fast forward last summer to Marcus Rashford, 20 years later, sharing how important the Breakfast Club was to his family on free school meals, and realize that the issue is now largely sorted. This is now a mainstream issue. It doesn't need campaigning anymore. It was a free school meal child, not a corporate leader, who persuaded politicians that this was common sense. But it started with a leader like Mike Darrington and that head teacher in Newcastle, with Durham University doing the research. So action for young campaigners, and there are some on this call. If you care about social justice, commit 5 hours a month as a minimum to get involved with a cause you care about. Either a cause that you understand because you've lived it, or because you haven't lived it and you don't understand it. Do something practical. Wash old people's hair in the care home, if you're allowed in. Coach a child and learn patience. Take your netball team to get the junior netball going in the local school. Rewrite the website in the community centre in your language, but all the time, think strategically about scale and impact. You've got to understand this stuff first from the bottom up. And the pleasure for me at the moment in having Mike Barton in Blackpool, where I'm working away, where by God does Mike Barton understand the issues in Claremont from the bottom up. But that's because he spent so much time on the front line. So I learned a lot on how do you convene the corporate sector. But the second example is about Teach First and bringing a cohort of young talent to tackle social inequity in schools. I've never been a teacher, but can tell you exactly the impact on me of Mrs. Kellaway and Miss MacDonald at Camden School for Girls in the 60s. And all of you can think back to the teachers that had the greatest impact on you in your early years. And as Bob has so cleverly reminded me, and I'm amazed that he sat his way through Desert Island Discs, when I was lucky enough to be chosen to be on Desert Island Discs, I chose Lara's theme from Dr. Zhivago and said it was a hymn to teachers. Because the moment I hear Lara's theme, I'm instantly transported back to the Russian Revolution and Miss MacDonald's incredible ability to inspire and take one to that moment. And the reason we all longed for long black coats with black velvet bands was entirely because of Lara's theme. And the reason I chose a 2,000-word jigsaw of Venice is my luxury, but alas, was not allowed to take either Liz Archibald or Philippa Fawcett, who I spend my holidays doing jigsaws with, and the most exciting was the Venetian one, because the greatest possible luxury for me and Philippa, and in fact, we're going to do it, Liz, this, maybe not this year, next year, is to just go and soak up Venice and realize, as that extraordinary man who ran BP for a long time, John Brown, said, what was it that we learned from Venice about the running of BP? And I said, well, what did you learn from Venice about the running of BP? He said, I learned that the moment that Venice stopped saying, what's the news on the Rialto? What's happening in the outside world? How can Venice drive this great competitive empire? The moment BP began to turn itself internally, only cared about what was going on in BP, didn't care about what was going on in the wider world, was the moment that BP began to lose the bloody plot. And of course, if they'd thought about climate change a bit earlier, they might not have lost the plot as soon as they did. So I love Venice. So back to Teach First. In 2002, I commissioned McKinsey, didn't pay for them, pro bono, on behalf of business in the community, to ask 50 head teachers in the most disadvantaged London secondary schools what was their biggest challenge. And a young management consultant called Brett Big Dortz was on the McKinsey team. And his report said that their biggest challenge in those schools was finding any maths, science, or English teachers to teach in the toughest schools. They would go and teach in the leafy glades and the easier places. And they said rather gloomily that if the Australians decided to go home, you'd have to run up the white flag and just give up. They had no teachers. Most reports just report and lie on the shelf. But Brett was absolutely determined that something should be done. And I agreed. And out of that came Teach First, partly based on a model that I'd seen, as Brett had, in America, called Teach for America. And it was about persuading those who'd never thought of teaching to come just for 2 years initially to teach their subject in the most disadvantaged schools. We started in London in 2003 with a cohort of 180 grads, drawn only from Russell Group universities, immensely competitive to get in. I think we had 8 times the numbers that we took. Since then, 16,000 graduates have joined the program. I was on the board from the beginning and chaired it from 2006 to 2014 as the scale increased and the evidence grew of the vital importance of bringing that young talent to join existing talent in those schools and to focus only on the schools in the poorest places. Ruthless. We wouldn't send them anywhere where the news was lifting, where the figures were getting better, where it was really beginning to turn. because that's where you've got to focus if social justice is ever to be achieved. We learned so much about the ability of young graduates to bring levels of determination and courage and resilience to the most difficult and impossible situations. Only 20% of the applications made the grade. So out of 7,000 applications in 2015, just 1,700 get in. They start with a 6-week summer institute, and I went in my time to everyone to understand what was the motivation. They did a master's and a PGCE in the first 2 years. And we learned that they then became fantastically employable in other sectors. Deloitte's told me in 2010 that the recruits they'd got, the maths recruits from Teach First, were in the top 5% of brain power they'd ever recruited, and were 3 times more likely to be promoted than others who'd come in on the graduate program. So what were the results? 40% move out of the classroom after 3 years, but that means that 60% stay. And these were people, by and large, who'd never thought of going into teaching. The first 100 head teachers are now appointed, leading some incredibly successful schools, with some 2,000 middle leaders in challenging schools waiting to come through, and fleets of social campaigners in education who are social entrepreneurs contributing to education in all sorts of ways. So rewind for social justice campaigners. Teach First was a real example, I learned, of systems change coming in from a moment of crisis and disaster. The London schools could not have been worse in 2003. And by 2007, with the London Challenge coming in, we saw the beginning of building London cohort results up now to 67% A to Cs. They were running at 31% in 2007. And many things have helped to make the difference, but Teach First contributed. And I suspect that post-COVID will be another moment of major innovation and change if we can get a grip on the wheels of power at the right moment. London schools were failing and were under the eyes of the new Labour politicians. Mood music matters if you're going to win the innovation arguments. And that was why Andrew Adonis gave us 16 million in 2008 to scale up across the country. And that's what got us to the Northeast and to the Northwest, and to begin to spread that talent. But that burning platform met another change in the attraction of graduates to careers with purpose and meaning. Liz is going to share a slide showing you the Teach First scale of growth over that 15 years. Well done, one more on. There we are. Now this shows an incredible figure, which we've only pulled out specially for today, which is that 6% of all teachers that have ever been recruited into Teach First have come from Durham. And these are only the figures which I got up until 2017. 642 amazing Durham students have gone into Teach First. And you look at the point of what they're looking for in their careers. Come on to the next slides, Liz. Huge differences in what Durham students want in their first jobs. In 2008, 25% of them said they wanted a job that allowed them to give something back to the community. In 2020, that figure has gone up to 40% of those who want purpose and meaning. Thank you, Liz, so much. You can stop that now. I think that's as much academic slide sharing as I've managed to get us to do. Because, of course, the mating call of the Porsche will always drive some students. They will always be keen, some of them, on the money. But what I think is so encouraging for those of us passionate about how you actually change the inequity in Britain is to see, in Durham particularly, but elsewhere too, that money matters, but for many of them it doesn't matter most. Having purpose and meaning is what does matter if you're going to change the world. And that's what's exciting as we see now the scaling up of this particular method. And as you may know, if I'm talking to young campaigners, I want them to consider starting their careers in one of what I call the Transform Society organizations. I chair that alliance now between those trying to inspire a generation into the public service. Teach First, I've talked about, Frontline, which is now taking social workers, Police Now, started by my daughter Tor as when she was chief inspector in the Met, and where Millie, one of Liz's ex-president, JCR presidents, is now doing a great job in ridding police force. Think Ahead, another initiative for mental health adult social workers, and the latest, Unlocked, for prison officers, where you could argue that to some extent, prison officers were just about considered to be half a pip higher than parking wardens. Now you've got a situation where 6,000 young people, graduates, applied to come into one of 400 places in prisons for prison officers. Having managed to see the immense importance of the contribution that prison officers make to the rehabilitation of prisoners. So those Transform Society organizations will this year recruit 3,000 grads and account for 55% of all graduate hires in the public service. So wherever you go, I'm talking to students, in your social justice journey, consider starting at the front line in disadvantaged communities, because systems leadership is where we need most influence. In my view, start there. Don't go and join the civil service fast stream, even though the civil service fast stream at the moment has knocked PwC off the number one of the most attractive brands for graduates. Start actually as a more earthed civil servant by going first to Police Now and then into the Home Office. 20% of this year's civil service fast streamers in the Department for Education have done Teach First. That's a rather better way, in my view, of changing the civil service than a lot of hard rain from Dominic Cummings. But the real measure for Teach First and success, as I saw it, was when we saw the recruitment of those who'd been taught by Teach Firsters in tough schools coming through to take their place as teachers in those schools. In the end, that's what it's about. So the third example, I'm speeding up, and highly relevant for the mood music of everybody in the Northeast who will now be in Darlington preparing for the arrival of 750 civil servants out of the Treasury. Can't get over how funny I think that is going to be, but anyway. In 2008, I stood down as Chief Exec of Business in the Community, having had the most marvellous, fun, fascinating 20 years. I was slightly sad that the Financial Times headline in my valedictory address said, "An enthusiastic child has been running Business in the Community for the last 20 years." I thought that was slightly rude, but I was prepared to believe that I always am wildly over-enthusiastic about what could be done. So I then moved to support the Prince of Wales on his Prince's Charities, which he's a serial entrepreneur, and there were about 22 of them. We managed to move some of them on there. And he appointed me as his czar for Burnley. Those of you who are the other side of the Pennines will know that Burnley is a Lancashire mill town with a very famous football team. I'd never been there until he appointed me as the czar of Burnley. And I then spent 48 hours every month for 7 years, working in support of the Burnley community and learning much about the importance of place and left behind communities. A riot in 2003, largely between poor young Pakistanis and poor young white, had brought Burnley to prominence. The local authority had invited us in to come and help, so we weren't parachuting in, and we raised the cash for a team of 6 working with the Prince's Trust and 10 other charities with a full-time leader based in Burnley. There are only 86,000 people in Burnley, like there are 146,000 people in Blackpool. So it's not very many people to get round and to understand what are the issues, what are the challenges, who knows who, what are the opportunities. And I swear, over the 7 years in Burnley, I met most of them via all sorts of connections with civil society and corporates and everything else. And what I learned there, a great lesson, was the importance of connecting the unconnected, the powerless, those who felt they knew they had no lever of power in the face of apparently insuperable odds. So connecting the schools to the employers, connecting the train station of Burnley to Manchester, connecting the small businesses to possible businesses who might want their goods, connecting the companies of Burnley to the local authority who they hated, and the local authority appeared to hate them at that moment, and putting wind under the sails of the community entrepreneurs and those trying to change their street or their housing estate seemed to me to be the opening agenda. And as ever, find some friends who share your view. And the friend for me was the leader of the council, Gordon Birtwistle, a tremendous old engineer, a Lib Dem, who amazingly, when the coalition came, suddenly arrived in the Treasury and did a lot of very good things to help Burnley on, as well as all the rest of us. But he and I set out together in 2007 to promote Burnley and to make it more promotable. The Prince's mantra was that we got to build the place, build the people, and build the pride. My mantra was we got to start where we were and measure every year what we'd changed using an independent evaluator. There's a very great danger about a lunch, a launch, and a logo in all of these things. You've got to stick there long enough to really see it change. And you've got to be really brave about facing into the wind as to whether you've made any difference at all. So the Cass Business School came in to evaluate the opening balance and did the closing evaluation about what had been achieved after 7 years. We did our best with the Prince's passion for saving a series of incredibly beautiful and decrepit old woolen mills in the Weaver's Triangle. We did save some. Probably more critically, we created something called the Burnley bondholders, which was all the corporates of Burnley that one could persuade who to stop complaining about the council and to try to come and find a partnership way through between the public and the private to promote Burnley, to talk up Burnley, to advocate for Burnley. Building trust is a long-term game, and that partnership with the Burnley bondholders began in 2009, and I went back in 2019 to see what had been achieved. Early on, we'd identified the 20 businesses with the greatest capacity to grow in the town and set out to link them with leaders in their industry sector who could help. The lovely Burnley Cake Company who employed 200 people, but said to me, we don't make much cake. We mainly make donuts for Manchester. So what's your limiting factor? Discovering anybody who needs cake. So I said, well, surely Pret-a-Manger are making bloody cake for the middle classes across the whole of Britain. Let's get them. They said, we don't know anybody in Pret-a-Manger. I said, well, luckily I do know Sinclair Beecham. He's the founder. And I forced Sinclair Beecham onto a train. He came to Burnley and he spent 2 days with the Burnley Cake Company. And by the time we'd finished, and it took a little longer than that, actually, Burnley Cake Company then got the carrot cake order from Pret-a-Manger and put 400 people on and absolutely boomed away. It wasn't as easy as all that, but we did our best with the other 20 companies. And we ran a lovely program called Born in Burnley. We're now running Born in Blackpool. I'm sure Durham is running Born in Durham, to track down those who cared about this place and were prepared to come to its aid. Interestingly, Burnley is now in the top 10 fastest growing private sector jobs of any northern town. School performance is improving. It's come off 32% when we began, and it's bumping at 51%. And although bedeviled by many challenges, COVID's hit it very hard. A strong private-public partnership is firmly in place. And that, for me, is what this is about. And I learned some other things about connections. The Cleverdon curve, after 7 years of argument and lobbying, was opened in 2020. This was 500 meters of track closed by Mr. Beeching in the 60s, which ensured the lack of connection to Manchester, taking nearly 97 minutes to travel 30 miles. Opening that curve, 500 meters, I could have dug it myself, has cut journey times to 42 minutes and enabled Burnley job seekers to get to the opportunities in Manchester and the commuters of Manchester to buy loft apartments in those elegant mills. I suppose what I learned most clearly in Burnley about young people was the power of collaboration and unusual partnerships to change lives. The best campaigner by a mile in Burnley was a brilliant young police inspector called Steve Hutchinson. He could tell me exactly what his issues were. There were 100 naughty boys in Burnley who were responsible for most of the burglary and most of the antisocial behaviour. And he wondered with me what we could do. We got the Prince's Trust to agree to run a 10-day programme, uphill, down Dale of the Pennines, for as many as we could persuade to come of those 100. And we broke every GDP rule in the book to get their names. Surprisingly, we said we'd get 5 young army officers and 5 young police community support officers who hadn't had much training in leadership as the team leaders. General Sir Nick Parker was rung up by the Prince of Wales, and me and Liz Archibald loved Greville Bibby, and he was made to do some things too. This unusual partnership set off and turned out to be an extraordinary success. We tracked the 100, 82% of them did not reoffend in the following 24 months as far as Burnley police knew. And certainly burglary fell like a stone during the 10 days they were on the course. Interestingly, a team of 30 on the course started their own organisation called Twister, teenagers working in society to earn respect, and became a great force of social action in their community. They were incredible. Many of them moved into jobs, used volunteering to raise their skills. 7% of them went into the army. So for young campaigners, and indeed anybody on the call, think about the places or communities you know well. and focus on mapping the complexity of the social justice issues which affect those communities. The North East has some amazing charitable and social enterprise initiatives, and I can see Fiona Ellis in my eye. The Northern Community Foundation has done some incredible work, as has Virgin Money. Whatever your passion or place, find some way to strengthen your understanding and support to other young people in this post-COVID world. A whole new recovery initiative will now start looking for coaches and catch up in schools. I think recovery is a better word than catch up. The Scouts and Guides are looking for 35,000 volunteers to come and restart the cubs and the beavers and the squirrels for 5-year-olds. Those passionate about health inequity, the NHS has now built the involvement of young people into their 10-year strategy. And that final point is my fourth example, and is the challenge of how we place young people at the heart of shaping the future of the world that they are living in and will inherit. In 2012, I did a review for the Prime Minister Cameron on how young people were involved in their community and what more needed to be done to encourage and support their practical action in the service of others. We launched the I Will campaign the following year, an all-party group of leaders, a 7-year timescale, a big goal to increase the social action opportunities for all young people. Vital for all of us to recognise the major gap between the 52% who are regularly involved, who are probably all on this call, and the 30% in poorer audiences, in poorer communities, who find it much more difficult to get involved. But remember, only 2% of all trustees on all charitable boards in the UK are under 25. So many barriers are to do with the dead hand of the old and the complacent sticking about for much too long. So if the only action that the over 60s take is to go and resign from a charitable activity and say you're only resigning if they put an under 25-year-old on instead, you will have done a very great service to the future. We've just evaluated the 7 years I Will campaign with some fascinating results. Amazingly, we raised 100 million to invest in social action, with some really interesting funders coming in. The Church of England, who runs 70% of all primary schools in Britain, doing some evaluation as to what exactly their primary schools were doing in their local communities. Really amazing stuff at the Church of England. Learned a lot. I think your diocese is in it. A habit of service research from the Jubilee Centre in Birmingham showed that starting young people much earlier in primary school on social action turns out to be far more sustainable than starting them at 16. So Mike Barton was absolutely right on the work that he was doing to get that police initiative into primary schools. Just where to begin. I think we also recognise that the power of young people has been increasingly recognised. Malala and Greta Thunberg as poster women for social justice. The power of Youth Charter been adopted by a good number of household names. But it's what happens in schools and colleges and universities that is the democratiser of this activity. We've got to work even harder to get this to happen in the schools, particularly where in the poorest places, they're far more driven to achieve the test results and have much less time for developing the whole child with arts, drama, social and emotional well-being. 1 in 6 children are now struggling with mental health post-COVID. So this may bring some new opportunities for us all. The NHS in 2014 had no encouragement for the involvement of under 21-year-olds to volunteer in health or social care. And not entirely surprisingly, the average age of NHS volunteers was 78. Pushing trolleys of books that nobody would read and arranging flyers that nobody is allowed. But the arrival of matrons, chief of nursing, to say what are the things that actually volunteers could do which would be valuable and which you can get past some interesting health and safety issues, turned out to be completely revolutionary. 35 health trusts have now set up youth volunteer units, and it's now enshrined in the 10-year NHS plan. Now, where is Durham and the North East on that? How many under 21-year-olds have we got in health and social care settings? And where's the welcome mat? They found in King's College London that getting volunteers to come into stroke wards to take part in moving people's muscles every 20 minutes after a stroke is transformational. But the NHS will never be able to pay for the numbers of physios you need to do that. So they've now got about something like 1,500 volunteers a week in that hospital, organised brilliantly, doing what they can do. And that is transforming, I believe, the pipeline of those who will come into the NHS and into social care. So what more could young campaigners do to review how they could help younger age groups to get involved in the community? What are the primaries of Durham doing? I watched a primary head, Caroline Vernon, in Barrow-in-Furness, run with students and apprentices a whole boot camp for 11-year-olds, managing the transition of primary kids to secondary, where the exam activity was 3 weeks worth of training them up to be researchers and journalists to identify the healthy eating habits needed in Barrow-in-Furness, which is probably one of the most unhealthy communities anywhere in the Western world. That was their first year. And then their second year, they did the healthy exercise habits. The local health authority did the evaluation and said that the primary kids had had more effect on transforming the eating habits and the exercise habits of Barrow-in-Furness than any other known initiative. So come along, Easington. I should think we could probably do it there. My last and final example is short and is put in for Liz, whose capacity for reading every book one has ever heard of is legendary. I chair the National Literacy Trust, where I learned about the generosity and passion of those who love books, publish books, write books, and their preparedness to do anything at all to help share that passion and pass it on. But I've also learned in the last 7 years that I've chaired it, some of the most compelling statistics about how fortunate we are if we can read and we can love books. 1 in 8 children in Britain do not own a book at home, maybe the Argos catalogue. 28% of primary 5-year-olds start primary schools without the literacy skills they need to succeed. 28% of 5-year-olds. 25% of all 15-year-olds in the UK have a reading age of 12 or below and are most unlikely to get the GCSEs they will need in the skilled economy of the future. 70% of prisoners can't read. This is, seems to me, a social justice and inequity issue of the most damning sort, but it can be tackled. And social justice campaigners need hope And this example gives me hope, which is why I'm finishing on it. Let me take you to Middlesbrough, there in the northeast, much talked about. Many of you, I'm sure, have been there, where we've worked in the National Literacy Trust since 2013, when the scores on the doors showed that 5-year-olds in 2 of the poorest wards arrived at school on the school readiness score 22 months behind where they needed to be. Not a hope of getting those kids to catch up with the future competitive world without focus, energy, drive, and partnerships. 2 years later, having thrown everything we knew at it, the great involvement of the local authority, incredible community activity, the gap had halved to 11.3%. By 2017, Middlesbrough schools saw a 4.4 increase in children achieving expected levels of literacy, double the national average of improvement. We're on our way in those wards. We know the answers now. And we've got 14 literacy hubs across the UK learning how to tackle this. And the answers lie in literacy champions on every street and in every council flat. Nurses in the James Cook Hospital in the special care baby unit, singing nursery rhymes with agonized new mothers to get them to realize that talking, playing, singing, reading is how babies connect. Attachment, bonding, communication, the ABC. We've got bus drivers handing out books to families. In Peterborough, a child can't have its hair cut without the barbers giving it the relevant book for its age as a present. Persuading McDonald's to put books, not plastic toys, into Happy Meals. So my final action for social justice campaigners, young or old, tonight, is to imagine a future where every university in the country took a percentage of their access money, perhaps matched it with their health authority, and found the ways to do these simple things in their poorest communities. And what if every student who minded about social justice and inequity and the future for Britain helped to organise it? Many of you already are, but we've got to do it with focus, and we've got to commit to go on doing it wherever we work until illiteracy is banished from the land. So for me, what have I learned? Setting a big goal, setting a time frame, connecting the unconnected, mobilizing and supporting the young, recognizing when it's the time to turn the page, convening those who have a shared ideal, and above all, never, never giving up, moaning on about the cause and the importance of it. But I've also learned the importance of friendship and keeping in touch and traveling to beautiful places together. And for that, I owe Liz and my Philippa an enormous debt of gratitude. And if I may dare speak for St. Cuthbert's and Durham, we're in your debt, Liz, for all that you have done to influence and encourage and inspire 9 generations of young people in this great college and university to widen their minds and their horizons and to prepare for their next chapter, many of them tackling as a profession or as part of their lives the social inequity which corrodes the happiness and the opportunities of the UK. So it's a great honour to have been invited to speak for you. Thank you very much indeed. I can see some chat coming up on the thing.